Welcome to the 92Y School of Music series Inside the Concert. I'm Naomi Lewin. I host the weekly radio feature and podcast Classics for Kids, and I'm the former afternoon music host of WQXR. Inside the Concert takes a closer look at repertoire from 92Y's Marshall Weinberg Spring 2021 classical music season. Flutist Brandon Patrick George is a part of that. On Wednesday, May 5th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, he will be on stage at Kaufman Hall with pianist Brian Wagorn. And that's part of 92Y's Almost Home series, which means that you can attend his concert in person. Brandon's program includes music by William Grant Still, Valerie Coleman, Carl Reinecke, Lily Boulanger, and Franz Schubert. There is a link for tickets at 92y.org and on the YouTube page. The concert will also be streamed live, and you can watch it online until May 12th. Brandon Patrick George has eaten my lasagna and lived to tell the tale. But tonight, we are not talking pasta, we're talking Wiener Schnitzel, or rather Wiener music, a piece by Viennese favorite son, Franz Schubert. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, Schubert is hardly famous for flute music, and you're right. The introduction and variations on Trockne Blumen, which is on Brandon's May 5th concert, is Schubert's only composition for flute. Tonight, Brandon will show us around the piece and play some bits from it, and he'll also answer your questions. So please put anything you would like to ask him into chat. Brandon, welcome to Inside the Concert.
Thanks for having me.
As I said, Schubert is not known for flute music. So how did he come to write this piece?
You know, we don't know a lot about the why. Based on what we do know, we believe that the piece was written for a flute professor, a colleague of his in Vienna at the time. But the piece comes shortly after the song cycle. So they're very close together, and it does make sense since it was so fresh in his mind, if he's been asked to write something to pull from recent material, of course, right? But we don't really know a lot as to why. We don't have a program to see that it was even performed, for that matter. So there's just a lot of speculation, but again, we do have manuscript copies, and I do know that in fact it was in his collection, and was written shortly after the publication of the song cycle.
And the song cycle is Die Schöne Müllerin, Schubert's first great song cycle. And we have actually video that we'll see in just a bit of Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing Trockne Blumen. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the song cycle and the context for this piece and where Trockne Blumen fits into the song cycle. This was Schubert spent so much of his time perfecting the German art song, and he was the one who Beethoven wrote the first song cycle, but Schubert was the guy who took the song cycle and ran with it and said, let's tell a story with this. So you want to talk a little bit about where Trockne Blumen fits in this whole story?
Sure. Well, it's later on in the cycle. I think it's good to note that in these song cycles and based on the poetry, it can be a bit fragmented, if you will. We don't always get a full sense of a person. We get a bit of this, a bit of that. So sometimes it makes sense that things can be extracted, but this part comes a bit later in the song cycle. And we start with his journey, right? We start with his journey and his background and he's traveling. He gets this job. He's there. He sees this beautiful.
This is the protagonist of the song cycle.
Yes, of course. And Yeah, and this song.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. The
No,
protagonist.
no, it's
No. Just to make it clear that you were talking about the protagonist of the song cycle and not Schubert.
right, exactly.
The journey.
Right.
So he sees the beautiful daughter of the miller and go on.
Right. And there we launch into this trying to, is she interested? Like, I see her. Do you see me? Like, I'm here. I like you. Do you like me? But there's a lot, but as we learn about him through this, the cycle, there's a lot of doubt, right? There's a lot of doubt and insecurity because of his profession not really being sort of like feeling like he has a lot to offer, right? And that, in fact, that perhaps it may not work out. So we go through this journey with him and he's trying to share this and get attention. And there's talk of flowers, of planting flowers out. We get this before this actual song, right? That he wants to plant flowers outside of her window. And about his tears. His tears will be the drops on those flowers when she wakes up in the morning and she sees them. But yeah, so this one, so after we learn all of these things, then we arrive at this moment where we're like, well, you know, it's very like, it's not gonna work, very sad, very tragic, but then it's also
pretty much throws him over for the hunter.
Yeah. So it's pretty bad. But then there's always sort of like this bit of like kind of optimism, like maybe like, well, when I'm gone, like maybe these flowers will bloom. And this is something that we've heard in other you know, song cycles as well.
So yeah, these are dried. The song Trockne Blumen is dried flowers, and these are flowers he has received from her.
Yes.
And he wants them on his grave, thinking that she will see them and know that he loved her, that he was true to her. And
there's a lot of, like, as you go through this, it's just like, oh, I don't think she's gonna know. I mean, it's very sad, actually,
right?
From the outsiders, but we all know what it's like to want someone and to admire someone, and I think we also know what it's like after the fact if something does not work out, and we've talked about it with a loved one, with a friend, a family member afterwards, and they usually can kind of tell us that they kind of saw the writing on the wall, so that they knew it wasn't exactly meant to be. And I think a part of me wonders, like, so as an outsider, so if he had that perspective, right? Because there's a lot that you feel like I don't really think it is ever going to work.
And really, Die Schöne Müllerin was an extraordinary thing because, as I said, this was the first time somebody had taken the set of poems existed almost as though Müller, who the poet, was somebody Schubert didn't know, but he knew his poetry. And Müller had sort of written them like, somebody take these and write a song cycle. And then Schubert did. He sort of weeded through, pulled out, sort of rejected a few
bits that's been taken out, right?
Yeah, he left off the prologue, the epilogue, and 3 poems, made his own story out of it, and then constructed this amazing song cycle that still lives today as just an extraordinary work of art.
Yes, and I think it's important to know that this beautiful song from the song cycle, Trockne Blumen, is not, I don't think, one of the more well-known songs out of the set. I think it's also interesting to know that this one song, that it's pretty brief, and as you said, we're going to hear a recording of it in a minute, but the entire performance of the entire cycle takes about an hour or more, like, right? So it's quite long, and this is a very, very small part that happens in the middle portion.
Actually, I think it's the third to last song in the set. So let's hear that performed by the best, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, and the pianist is a very young Christoph Eschenbach. That was from a complete performance of Die Schöne Müllerin at the Salle Pleyel in Paris in 1992. Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau and Christoph Eschenbach at the keyboard with Trockne Blumen, the song that your variations are based on. And if Schubert's flutist friend made that choice, why do you think he chose this song, or why do you think Schubert chose this song for variations?
That's a good question. I think when we dive into the flute part in just a moment, you'll be able to compare the song that you just heard and the way he lays it out for the flute and piano. I think it lends itself to it's pretty simple. So there's room for embellishment. So as you'll see, Schubert added a lot of things. I think because of the structure of the song, I think between the dark, section in the minor key, the section that we have in the major key, this allowed Schubert to be able to approach the variations in a way where in the first half of the any given variation, we might have something that's a little bit more darker, a little bit more somber, melancholy. And then when we shift and we go to the more optimistic, bright key of E major, that gives us a lot of room for virtuosity, for lots of notes, for really brilliance, it really allows Schubert to both show off the piano and the flute. I think whatever melody that he would decide on, it had to be something that would work for both instruments to be showcased well, because as you're going to see as we go through these variations, it's not just a flute piece, but it's really a duo between flute and piano. So
and that's Schubert really also in his songs too, because that was one of the things he did with art songs, was he made the pianist part of the story, part of the narrative. And you're saying he does that in the variations too.
Yes, he does that in the variations, and I think that's why it is a real jewel in the flute repertoire, because so much music from the 19th century that we have was written by a lot of sort of composers who played the instrument but weren't really known as composers, and so what you end up with are pieces that really are virtuosic, but they don't have the same emotional depth that a piece like Trockne Blumen, based on a song by Schubert, would have. You also don't have the same type of dialogue, because these musicians were pretty much interested in one thing only, and that was showing off the flute. They were not so interested in the real collaborative nature of the writing that great violin sonatas, cello sonatas that we love, these real masterpieces that are true, and as you said, song cycles where they are true duos. They support one another, they take turns, right? And we really get that. So I really feel that in the variations, he wanted to go with a theme, and I don't want to speak for Schubert, but I think that whichever theme he would choose, that it needed to be something that would work well for both the flute and the piano, and allowed him to really build on it. Because if something has a little too much already built in, it doesn't really leave you a lot of room to grow, and he really needed that. And as you're going to see, we start off with what is really a pretty simple theme, and we just go to a whole nother universe from there.
Well, let's go to that universe. So as you said, he wrote this piece right after, just months after finishing Die Schöne Müllerin. This dates from January of 1824, and he finished Die Schöne Müllerin at the end of 1823. And this piece, he starts off with an introduction,
yes,
the theme, then 7 variations. And I found it interesting. The piano opening of the introduction is not the same as the song.
No, what we have is we don't just have the chords, right? Chord.
Yeah, the song started with just 4 chords.
4 chords. That's all we have, and I think that sort of we're thinking where, as you talked about earlier, where this song falls in the cycle, right? So we have to think what comes before, right? What comes before, and this transition into set the mood for something, for this new song that we're going to go on. However, when we with the variations, we don't have that. We're not coming from anything, right? So he had to find a way to set the mood for this theme. And so that's where we get this very, very somber, what is, I think we can all, a lot of us say, is a funeral march.
What, you know what? It reminded me absolutely of Death and the Maiden, the da, 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 instead of just playing chords. That's how the piano starts your piece. And
Yes.
it's, yeah, it really does feel like a Schubert, as you say, funeral march.
As a funeral march. And and as we, you know, travel through other repertoire from, you know, the 19th century, we can think about Beethoven, Symphony 7, second movement. We have the funeral march there. You know, Chopin, this rhythm, this long, short, long, short, and that's usually played at a pretty slowly, stately tempo. I almost think of it as it's almost like the heart when it's like, you know, around, I think about like around like 60, I think about
the heartbeat.
The heartbeat. Yes. So, and I think in terms of interpretation, particularly of this opening, I like to approach it with one that isn't too fast, because I think that we really need to get into that world.
But the flute is not playing the funeral march. The flute has a more sustained part. You want to show us, give us a little bit of the intro?
Sure. So in the beginning, there are two measures of this slow progression from the pianist. And when the flute comes in, he marks pianissimo in the flute part, and long, slow, sustained notes that outline E minor, kind of, sort of. It's not very, we get it mostly from the piano, but once the flute enters, it's pretty much a world where we're not really sure where we're going. And I think that's very intentional, because he's not ready yet to reveal to us where we are going. And the beginning goes something like this.
So beautiful, but not the song.
It's beautiful, and it's not the song, but we come back to, in the song, we go from this very dark reflection on these dried flowers, right? The grave. But then there's this hint of optimism slightly, because spring is going to come and they will bloom, right? We can even hear this in the opening, because although the first three measures that I play are pretty much in E minor, at the very end of the phrase, he puts F sharps, G sharps, we even have some C sharps, and that's hinting at something a little bit brighter, E major. And that's also setting up the mood for this piece that's going to go back and forth between this dark mood and this bright celebratory mood. And it's all coming back to this song.
So let's get to the theme. After the introduction, then you actually get the theme, and that starts with the piano again, taking the lead, playing the melody, and then the flute and the piano kind of trade it back and forth, almost like a call and response, where I'm going to play it, I'm going to play it, I'm going to play it.
I
Uh,
think, I think that's so interesting. If that we've just heard beautiful, beautiful recording where the song is there is no the piano is playing this accompanying role, right? The piano never plays this melody, but Schubert in the variations from the very beginning, he's letting us know that this is about both the piano and the flute. So the piano will play the phrase for a few measures, and then the flute will play it. And that is really how we're going to go through the entire set of variations. He's really showing us that these two musicians, that these parts, they're equal.
So let's hear a little bit of it on the flute, the song melody. And you and the piano just sort of keep that up through stating the theme.
Yes, when the piano plays it the first time we hear the theme for 8 measures, it's pretty straightforward. I think it's more like what you hear, what we see in the score for the voice and piano part with the melody, right? But then when the flute comes in, there's grace notes, there are flourishes. It's more of of course, he's used this theme to set up mood, to give us to tell a sort of a story, even almost a story like a song without words, if you will. But he's also remembering that this is now an instrumental work. And so I want to treat this as such. And so I'm going to put more notes in. I'm going to do, there are going to be grace notes. There's going to be some more runs. It's not just going to be the simple melody, even though the flute, I think the flute is a very beautiful melodic instrument. I think that he knew that, that it would be a little bit more effective to go a little bit faster in the tempo. The tempo is marked up slightly from what we hear and the vocal part. And there's just more notes. It's more fluty. So you can tell that he knew what he was doing.
And speaking of more notes, the first variation, 30-second notes.
30-second.
Lots of them.
Yeah, there are lots of 30-second notes. But what I love about the second variation is that he uses the 30-second notes in a way that they go from sort of murmuring sort of low in the dark low register of the flute in the opening to by the end we are more high and it's more exuberant, more open. Again, we've changed keys. We began in E minor, we're now in E major. I just really love because though the note values are they're quick, right? We all see 30-second notes and we're like, oh my gosh, there's so many notes. There are very few places to breathe. But he's Schubert. He's not going to lose sight of being a melodic and lyrical, a real sense of line. They always inform one another. You know, it's just not going to be virtuosity just to show off.
I got to tell you that the sound of the flute awakened Quetzal. So let's hear some of that variation.
Sure.
And by the end, we're talking triplets and 64th notes.
Yes, it gets quite fast. But I just think they're just these huge slurs. And I really just think that it is virtuosic, but at the same time, it's very, very lyrical, and he doesn't want to lose sight of the line ultimately, that it's still going to be very melodic.
And the next variation, the piano gets the 30-second notes.
The piano gets the 30-second notes. I have to say, as a flute player, you might think that I particularly love the flute variations, but I actually really do enjoy the piano variations where the flute gets to be more like in the background and play the supportive role, because they're quite impressive. The second variation almost seems like it's a study in octaves, particularly for the piano. The entire variation, the pianist is playing octaves in the left hand very, very quickly. It's very, very stormy. And
declamatory.
Yeah, yes. And again, we've ended to previous variation, very cheery and E major. And here we are again. It's stormy. It's sad. But the piano is really having its opportunity to really show off. And the whole opening of the variation is very loud. The dynamic does not change. I always like to say that Schubert was very clear with what he wanted in terms of dynamics. You know, in earlier periods of music, composers didn't write very much, but I feel like and we talked about the introduction, the theme, the first variation, you know, we really get a sense that he knows the instruments and he knows what he wants. And so for the second variation just to be forte and the piano when the piano, it'd be one thing to have one voice in the left hand, right? But when you double it, that's also going to up the volume. So he knows what he wants, and he's saying he wants a lot of sound, and that it is supposed to be very, very stormy. I can't wait.
You're not doing nothing during this. You've got the tune.
I have the tune that appears every few measures, so that I interrupt. I join in basically because the piano never stops. It never stops throughout it. But I join in with the tune, and I play the tune in a more heroic, more aggressive way. The piano, to match the sound of the piano. So we have, again, this march-like quality, but very, very aggressive at a very, very loud dynamic.
Now, by variation 3, there's yet another change of mood, but by now we've sort of drifted away from verbatim quotes of the song, haven't we?
Yeah, this is where I feel like we've come back to one. We should know that in this variation, the flute has had its moment in the first variation, right? The piano has now had its moment in the second variation. And now what Schubert does is he brings the two together. And this is basically a song. It really is basically like a song. You have this flowing accompaniment figure and the piano in the left hand, but it's still a duo. It's still a duo because in the right hand, the flute and the piano are in conversation with one another. We're trading off. Sometimes we're moving together. I play a phrase, the piano will play the phrase. You'll hear the same sort of melody in the right hand. And we join up from time to time. But there we are sort of back to the song, to just Schubert as a great leader.
Give us a taste of that one.
and then the piano plays the exact same thing that I've played. And we get to join in, and we take turns, and we trade off. And I love it so much. I'll continue and play a little bit more. After the piano plays the first melody that I played, I join in, and we can converse with one another. I think it's also good to note that after we've had this opening, at this point, we've had the introduction in E minor. We've had the main theme that is in both E minor and E major, and the first two set of variations that go back and forth between the two. This is the longest time that we actually stay in this very bright, open, cheery key of E major.
Right. No switch in that one.
Yes.
However, in the next one, there is a switch.
There is a switch. This one is, again, I'd say we are switching back now to the piano as the real soloist and this variation. Again, I join in and play the melody in a more soft, lyrical way. And the first piano variation, it was more stately, right? Very loud, very present. But then in this one, I just sort of interject with a nice little charming flourish from time to time. It's very lyrical, but with grace notes that we have. So in the second variation, we had, right? But in this one, I have, just very light, very cheery. But meanwhile, the piano has the stormy part. The piano has all the notes, all 30 seconds, just really, really going at it. And rather than, as we saw in the second variation, where I'm joining in and matching the character of the piano, this is different. The piano is very much so present, very loud, very virtuosic. But then I come in and it's just very gentle. It's very nice. And rather than waiting until the second half of the variation, as we've seen when it changes keys to sort of change the mood, Schubert's now changing mood every 2 measures. It's like the piano has its moment, it's stormy, and then the flute, it's just very light, very, very delicate. I also think that's a great opportunity for the flutist to have a bit of rest, actually, because he was Schubert, great composer, knew exactly what he was doing, because what comes later, there's a lot more happening for the flute. So he really knew how to trade off the instruments, to both give them spotlight, to both make a huge, very bold musical statement, but also manage to sort of be very practical and know, like, okay, the flute player has played a lot. The flute player will need a bit of rest, so we're going to make this variation the piano variation. So
now, in the 5th variation, the piano is holding down the fort song melody-wise. Show us what's going on in the flute part while the piano is playing the song melody. So you needed that rest.
I need that rest. There are lots and lots of notes. The flutist is just going crazy. And I think it's interesting to note, of course, like we've talked about, going back to this theme that while sometimes he begins in a very, very dark manner and it starts out, and then we'll get very virtuosic later. at this one, the piano is just really giving us the theme, and the flute is just like going up and down the entire instrument. I also find it very fascinating in this variation that this was not the original variation that Schubert wrote. There actually was a variation that he put in and he later took out, which again lets us know that he worked with a flute player that told him and showed him how the instrument worked. I actually have an Urtext edition that actually publishes the original variation. So people sometimes people might want to perform it, but it's also interesting to have for a reference. And it's nothing like this variation. And I just want to show you here. You can just even see on the page, the writing is actually very much like a violin part, actually. Mm-hmm. If you look, there are lots of very, very wide intervals, very, very wide leaps, lots and lots and lots of octaves. These are things that are much, I think, easier to do on string instruments because of you can cross the bow, right? You can cross the rope can cross over the string, and so you also could kind of see like I think he was used to writing for stringed instruments.
He was not a flutist, so
not flutist.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so he had this idea, well, I'm going to put this in, but we're pretty sure that the flutist probably said, oh, this is not very
much.
And no. And I think it's interesting to note that, you know, the flute from Schubert's time is very different than the flute that we have today. It was more like a Baroque flute. So it didn't have the capabilities to do a lot of the things that we can do now. So it does make sense that he would change it after consulting a flute friend about what works and what does not work so well.
Speaking of Baroque, Variation 6 to me sounds like Bach. All of a sudden we're doing canons and it's like we've entered a whole nother world.
Yeah, it's really, for me, I just think back to Bach and great counterpoint and the voices, the lower voices and the upper voices, and not so much how they are separate, but how they work together. They are separate and they can stand alone, right? If you were to hear the piano part played by itself in that variation 6, you might not even feel like you were missing that much. But then when you add the flute part, it adds so much more. It does, because the flute part, as I said, in a lot of these variations might not seem like so much because the piano might have the spotlight. But again, as you said, Bach, and it really has to do with these two voices. They may seem simple, but how do they interact with one another? And again, this whole piece is really a dialogue and a conversation between both the piano and the flute. They are both solo instruments. The piano is not merely accompanying. So yes, we are really hearing counterpoint. We're hearing duos. We're hearing canons. We're hearing all these different things happening in Variation 6. And I'm so excited to play that one because I think it. When I play it with piano, I'm always just like, this might be my favorite variation. It's not the one where I have the most notes, right?
Show us some Schubert Bach.
So it's very light.
And the only one that's in triple meter too.
The only one. It is the only one. And it's really, and it is the only one that doesn't end.
Yeah, he's clearly going, okay, we've got the end coming up because, yeah, as you said, it ends on a dominant, like, and
yes, yes. So we hear it's very much like Bach, and we have a lot of counterpoint. But this one is also pretty bright. We're mostly in E major most of the time. We're kind of going back and forth, but overall, it's quite joyous. And we don't quite. He's really setting us up to finish this piece out.
And then he finishes with a march, or at least it starts as a march.
It starts as a march.
And back to sounding like Schubert.
Yeah. And after, I think at this point in the variations, we've had probably over 15, probably 16, 17 minutes worth of music. And now, only now that we arrive here on this last variation, we're happy. It's a march. It's joyous after this long journey of sadness, of, I think, searching. I think searching is the word that I like to use in describing these variations, because it's very unsettled, right? We never feel like we quite arrive, even in each variation that ends in the bright key of E major with the flute and the high register and big full chords from the piano. We always immediately go back to something that's very dark, introspective, stormy. But now, when we finally have sat through and gotten through all of this great music, he's willing to let up a bit and let us have a bit of sunshine, I think.
It's a great piece, and I can't wait to hear you play it. You said that this is really, there is very little music for the flute from Schubert's time. Is that because the flute was going through an evolution? And do you have your Baroque flute there so you can show us the evolution?
I do have my Baroque flute here, and I'm happy to show you a bit. Yes, I like to think that we don't have a lot of music from that period, because the flute was going through lots of changes. So here I have a copy of what a flute from Bach's time. So this is a copy of what people performed on during the Baroque era. And the flute, this model of flute where you see we have 6 holes to be covered by the fingers, and then we have 1 key here that actually you don't cover, but you actually press down to vent the key down here. This flute pretty much was the flute from Bach's time, from Mozart's time. As we approached, Romanticism and, symphony orchestras growing, right? Concert halls getting bigger. The flute really needed to find a way to keep up, right, with the orchestra, with the sound. We also needed to find a way that would make it easier to play chromatically. So to play lots of different notes in an easier fashion, similar to violin, other string players. We just could not do that. So unfortunately, depending on where you lived in the 19th century, particularly the early 19th century, the flute was just, it could be very different. The flutes in France were not the flutes that you necessarily saw or heard in Germany and other places. And of course, as we all know, composers at that time really favored piano, favored cello, piano, but those instruments didn't really change. They didn't change, and they have the capabilities to do all the things that composers wanted, right? So we have a bit of gap in our repertoire. We have so much great music from Bach's time, right? We have so much great music by Mozart, both concerti and the writing in the operas and the symphonies is just exquisite. But and even in the early Romantic, we have great writing within the orchestra, but I don't think that what composers wanted to do, the flute just could not do. And as you can see, these instruments are very, very different. And we didn't actually arrive on this being the modern flute sort of being widely accepted and played wherever you would go and be able to hear Western classical music until the latter portion of the 19th century, where we decided that, okay, to play louder, we should change from wood to metals such as silver and gold. We need to play more notes and a lot faster. So we need some help. So we need some keys. We need tone holes. As you can see here, there are holes that are drawn from the tube, which also helps with projecting of the sound. If you look at this flute that I have here, the holes are quite small. I think a real clear something that you can see is the embouchure plate and the embouchure hole on the Baroque flute are very, very different. It's I would say probably about almost half the size. So dynamically, we couldn't get a lot of sound out of this flute.
Can you play the Schubert on the Baroque flute?
There's a lot of things that you can play. I'll play for you a little bit so you can hear the sound. So those are that's the very opening of the Schubert. You can also hear, when you hear a wooden flute with this darker quality of sound, you immediately understand why Schubert would, in the beginning of this piece, with this very, very somber funeral march, and have the flute enter so mysteriously, pick a very, very delicate note and the softest register of this instrument. I find it to be very haunting, almost.
Really beautiful, really beautiful. You said that Schubert's piece fits into a larger dialogue of works for flute based on stories of love and loss. How so? What are some of the other works?
The other works on the program are Karl Reineke's Undine Sonata, based on the story of Undine. Yes. And again, a story of love that does not end very well and ends very tragically. But, something that I had been thinking a lot about when I put together this program, when I was asked to do this, there are lots of great works for flute that could fit on any program from all the different centuries, right? But I thought for this program, it's going to be in the spring, right? It comes after a year of intense sadness, of mourning loss of loved ones, of friends, of life as we've known it. And I just really thought I wanted to find a way to really create a program of music that listeners can be able to experience and hear that throughout the centuries, these stories of love, of loss, have been told over and over again because they are simply, it's the human experience. And whether it be a myth, right, or from a set of poetry, or the last piece that I'll have on my program is by Valerie Coleman, who is an amazing composer, amazing flutist, and was my predecessor in Imani Winds. She is doing incredible things now with great commissions from the Philadelphia Orchestra and other great orchestras. But this piece that she wrote, this sonata for flute, she calls Wish Sonatine, and she was inspired to write this based on the journey of slaves to this country through the Middle Passage. And so I thought these stories, this of love, of loss, whether it be a myth or something that really that happened and is a painful, dark place in history, it all connects because it all talks about the human experience. And I wanted to give people an opportunity to hear these works together and to experience them. And this way, I think it'll also leave room for people to find their own stories in the music. Because again, we go back to the Schubert, but remember that, you know, we may know what the original song was, but when that's taken away and it's just an instrumental work, flute and piano, we're sort of left to interpret it as we will and come up with our own stories as we listen.
That's a great place to leave this. I just want to mention, though, that you have a new CD that just came out last year. In 25 words or less, you want to tell us about that, and whether you have any other recordings coming out?
So I do have a CD. It was released in October of 2020. It features music by J.S. Bach, Claviajo, Sergei Prokofiev, and Pierre Boulez. It's available online, wherever you listen, stream, purchase your music. You'll be able to find it. That was my first recording, so I wanted something that really sort of gave audiences an opportunity to hear all of the music that I play and my different interests. But yes, another recording will be coming, and I think coming out, I'm planning on that. And I think that this program that I've put together for 92nd Street Y is one that I think really speaks to me right now, and really will speak to listeners and the times that we're living in. And so I'm hoping to have that out for people to hear very soon. So I'm on to the next recording project.
Great. Brandon Patrick George, thank you so much for being on Inside the Concert from 92Y School of Music. All of you can celebrate Cinco de Mayo by hearing Brandon perform at 92Y on May 5th with pianist Brian Waghorn. There are still tickets left to attend that concert live, in person, in a mask, but not you, Brandon. You won't be wearing a mask. The rest of us, however. And of course, Brandon's concert will also be streamed online. That's at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday, May 5th. And then will be available for another week online. There is information about tickets and all the safety protocols for the live performance at 92y.org. Coming up, April 29th, 1 week from tonight on Inside the Concert, my guest will be clarinetist Anthony McGill. And on May 13th, it's pianist Stuart Goodyear. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. And thank you for any and all contributions to support the great programming from 92Y.